I didn't like Bridgerton. I don't know how controversial this is going to be because I don't know anyone who has seen Bridgerton and gone, yes, I loved that. There may be people, but almost everyone I've talked to has come away with a weird feeling about it. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, obviously. I'm arguing that the show, in my opinion, is bad. There is no shade to anyone who likes this show. I know I like films or TV shows that are considered to be objectively bad by other people. But today I want to talk about all the reasons why people may think they like this series and how it actually has nothing to do with the show itself. And obviously I'm not talking about the acting, I'm talking about the world of the show, the writing, etc. It is all familiar to us. There are many references and familiar plot devices that we have seen before and we are drawn to that. So I will be talking about all the ways I think I was tricked. I'm going to be inserting my own references into this video, so let me know if you find them. This is not spoiler free. Obviously Bridgerton's been out for many months now and I talk about a lot of the different plot points that happen in it. Also, this is a trigger warning because one of the plot points is SA, and so just be aware of that. I do not go into detail other than say that it happened. Okay, I'm going to shut up and get straight into it. For me to talk about Bridgerton, I need to talk about intertextuality. Intertextuality is when the meaning of a text, movie, any form of art is shaped by another text or piece of art. Nerdwriter made a great video about this where he describes it as a form of emotional currency that uses our love and nostalgia for things from our past to make us feel a certain way about this new character or story. That video is 5 years old, yet it is still relevant to the storytelling trends in Hollywood and on the small screen today. I'll link it below. Anyway, intertextuality, when done right, can be a very effective tool in storytelling. Stranger Things is a great example of this. The Duffer Brothers' love for all things 80s bleeds into the show. We get references to films like E.T., Nightmare on Elm Street, Goonies, not just in the plot, but also in the cinematography. They've picked the right music so it fits with what's going on. But the most important thing is that this series stands on its own. It does not require you to have seen any of these films before for you to understand these characters or enjoy the story. And most importantly, these references do not shout at you, notice me. The thing about Stranger Things is that it has so many influences that have been twisted or inverted or taken further that it becomes greater than the sum of its influences. When intertextuality becomes about objects or people, that's when the territory gets a bit murky. Quite often, when you haven't seen the original text on which the reference hinges, you can tell you're supposed to be watching some big moment, but you just feel nothing. I feel like Peter Jackson, as much as I love him, really weaponized intertextuality in the Hobbit trilogy, relying on people's love for the original Lord of the Rings films to get people to watch. You could also call it extreme fan service. I grew up watching the Lord of the Rings films at least once a year, and I only read the books later as a teenager. Compare this to my dad, whose attachment was to the books, and it makes sense as to why I went to see all 3 Hobbit films in the cinema, and my dad tapped out after one and has flat out refused to ever watch the other 2. Frodo wasn't in The Hobbit, yet he appears in the film. When he appeared on screen, because I was remembering everything I'd seen him go through as a character, I felt very emotional. He was there specifically to trigger that emotional response. The mini Council of Elrond and Sauron, we have this big subplot which just felt like filler and an excuse for us to see Dark Galadriel, which in itself is a huge intertextual moment, as is any moment where Legolas appears on screen. But instead of it being a moment where we see Galadriel's inner conflict, whether to give in to her dark impulses and the pull of the ring versus the desire to protect her people and the world from the threat of Sauron, we get, okay, this is how she uses her power, I guess. It sort of cheapens the moment in The Lord of the Rings for me. And I think the studio and the production team behind The Hobbit got caught up in creating their own cinematic universe rather than pulling off a good adaptation. Anyway, now that I've talked a bit about intertextuality, back to Bridgerton. Everything about this show is meant to be intertextual. It's the USP of this show. It's Jane Austen, but modern. But you cannot rely on a concept being unique or visually pleasing. The content, the writing has to be good. Otherwise, we're just being manipulated into thinking something is good when it isn't. You don't keep ice in the fridge. First, the very familiar plot devices. We see plenty of plot devices and storylines that we have seen before in Bridgerton, really popular ones that have been done with much better results or just more iconically. First, the Jane Austen question. Right from the off, Bridgerton is telling you how much it wants you to think about Jane Austen. The love interest between an aloof, very rich man and an appealing woman, even though Daphne is definitely more of a Jane than Elizabeth. Again, right out of the book. Forced marriage, the unattractive man being forced on our female protagonist by a family member only to get rejected, a family with lots of daughters, a wet male love interest. The comparisons go on, not just with the novel, but with their iconic screen adaptations too. It is deliberately foisting this comparison on you to produce fuzzy feelings of warmth, and I found it to be not handsome enough to tempt me. I wasn't even trying to be subtle with that one, I'm very sorry. While this series is relying on Jane Austen fans to make that connection, it doesn't live up to the comparison at all. This series has been written by people who think that Jane Austen is the mother of the romance novel, which shows that they do not get Jane Austen at all. She is a legend because of her biting social commentary, her humour, and the fabulous female protagonists and characters she has provided us with. If you think about all the characters that are looking for a husband or obsessed with marriage, Austen makes fun of them. The Steele siblings in Sense and Sensibility, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. The fact that she provides her heroines with what society at the time would deem a happy ending does not a romance novel make. All of her heroines have story arcs that have nothing to do with romance. Emma's story arc is realising her obsession with thinking she knows what's best for other people is stopping everyone from getting what they truly want, including herself. Catherine Morland learns not to let herself get carried away by her imagination and live in the real world where real people have feelings. Fanny Price learns her own value and how to go after what she wants because she deserves to be happy. What does Daphne Bridgerton learn? Nothing. Daphne violates her husband Simon, and then for some reason, she ends up mad at him. Sure, he may have deceived her, but Daphne seems to think that justifies what she did, and she never receives any accountability for her actions, and indeed gets rewarded with exactly what she wants at the end of the series. It shocks me that the author of the original book said, but at the time, not a single person really said anything. If anything, the reaction was, "You go, girl." Later saying, "I'm not saying what she did was right, I'm just saying it's harder for a modern woman to understand it than it was 20 years ago. I'm only 27 years old, admittedly, but I'm pretty sure SA was still SA 20 years ago. Marital SA is something that authors have been writing about for over 200 years. Women have been victims of marital SA as long as marriage has been a thing. I don't think many would relish seeing someone else experience what they went through. Two wrongs don't make a right. I just don't understand why Shonda Rhimes and Netflix chose this series to adapt when people like Georgette Heyer have been writing great Regency romances without SA in them. Georgette Heyer has been credited with inventing the historical romance and virtually creating the subgenre of Regency romance. I've only read 2 of her novels so far, but I think she's great, so I'm definitely not a romance snob by any means. The second comparison I want to make is the Gossip Girl analogy. I feel like anyone who has had access to TV or the internet in the last 10 years knows about Gossip Girl. I just looked it up and it was first broadcast in 2007, which is making me feel old. Anyway, the whole premise behind the show is that there is this anonymous blogger that narrates the show, and she blogs about the lives of the Upper East Side rich kids and their families, exposing their secrets. And yes, I was as disappointed with the reveal of who Gossip Girl was as you probably were. I thought it should have been Dorota. Anyway, the reboot of the show that is currently airing, I've seen a few episodes, but I'm reserving judgment. Something I'm enjoying though is the fact that we know who the new Gossip Girl is from the first 15 minutes. As well as the fact that we have this Gossip Girl figure, we also have the fact that we're dealing with high society in Bridgerton and the fact that there are multiple parties in every episode. Anyway, the comparison of the two is something that the show actively leans into. Unlike Gossip Girl, where I was entertained and I clearly had feelings about the reveal, I kind of felt nothing when the reveal of Lazy Whistledown happened. I was just like, okay, that's a thing now. Mainly because Eloise was the only person who seemed to really care who it was. And actually, if you stop to think about it, it was quite obvious, which actually, because most people were binging it over Christmas, no one really was stopping to think. Gossip Girl set the bar so low that we had news articles praising how the reveal made sense. Of course it should make sense. It was a 1-season long story arc. Anyway, the characters seemed to solve their problems really easily, even despite fear of Lady Whistledown. So what was the point of her? The outcome would have been the same if they had just cut out the middleman. They were at a party after all. You know what they say, a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Well, the truth travels faster. Serena's whole storyline was justified. We were talking about manslaughter. The stakes were high. And yes, while a woman's reputation did need to be spotless, the problem was solved really easily. Bridgerton's reliance on the Gossip Girl effect of having these big, lavish party set pieces, which were obviously hugely expensive, didn't work for me. Don't get me wrong, these sets were beautiful and everyone involved did an amazing job, from the hair and costumes to the cinematography. It just didn't make up for the bad writing. If you're going to be at a party, then something has to happen at that party that cannot happen in a drawing room or on the street. Otherwise, what's the point? Literally, so many of the conversations that happens at these parties could happen somewhere else. Since we're talking about everything needing to fit with the story, maybe I've been watching too many Korean dramas, I don't know. But like I was saying about the parties, sex scenes should demonstrate something about these characters' personality, provide an insight into the characters' relationships, or drive the plot forward. Bridgerton buys into the fact that shows like Game of Thrones, shows like Outlander, that have used lots of sex have been really successful. We've all watched enough Game of Thrones to know that nudity or sex scenes with no purpose just gets annoying after a while and ruins the pacing. I've seen a few episodes of Harlots. That show has lots of sex scenes. The difference between the two shows is twofold. First, it is literally a series about prostitutes. It is all telling you about them as characters, or it's literally part of the plot. They don't just tack on some nudity to make what the characters are saying more interesting. Harlots is funny, well written. Comparing those characters to the ones in Bridgerton is just an unfair contest. I would highly recommend you going to watch Harlots. Something more comparable to Bridgerton, and I never thought I would be using Game of Thrones as an example of something good about sex scenes, but we're talking season 1 here, where basically everything was lifted straight from the books. A happier time. Specifically, the brothel scene with Littlefinger. Despite being a straight man surrounded by naked women most of the time, we are finding out through this scene that Littlefinger's dedication to his revenge and his long-term goal to marry the woman of his choice is something that he's unwilling to compromise his body for. Because it's one thing for a notorious liar like Littlefinger to say it, but it is another thing for us to see it. It tells us something about his moral code and his goals. We would see later that he's more than capable of using his body to get what he wants, though, once the future that he envisions is no longer possible. Or I guess more accurately, we hear it. Poor Sansa. And justice for Roz. Anyway, apart from the obvious scene in Bridgerton that is crucial to the plot, I was so bored by the two of them consummating their marriage all over the place. I find storylines where the conflict comes from miscommunication to be infuriating anyway, so I just was not invested at all in the two of them. Also, the fact that they seem to go from indifference to dislike to being very attracted to each other very quickly gave me whiplash. I ended up watching most of their scenes on 1.5 speed, if I'm going to be quite honest. I don't know if we were missing some big time jumps that they just didn't explain properly, but also insinuating that Jane Austen is a prude, so they had to add sex to get you to watch. Rude. There is sex in Jane Austen, it's just left off the page. Characters make sexual jokes, even female characters. If you read Jane Austen, you see the sexual attraction between her characters, but one of the themes of Jane Austen's writing is that sexual attraction alone does not make for happy marriages. So to sum up this section, Bridgerton leans so much into its references and inspiration for its plot devices that it begs the question, what does it bring that is new or fresh or exciting in the source material? I've struggled to find any. Which brings me on to the next section, the styling of the show. Don't get me wrong, there were things I enjoyed. I did enjoy the vibrancy of the set pieces and the costumes. I love the brightness of it all. I am a survivor of the Battle of Winterfell after all. People keep using the word modernised to describe this show, but compared to other period dramas that are drab and grey, look at all our decadence, look how bright we are, even when it's supposed to be dark outside. And to that, I say that says more about the advances in colour correction and HD filming techniques than anything else. No offence to the team behind Bridgerton, but it's nothing I haven't seen done better in a K-pop music video. I will be honest, I'm still not 100% sure what everyone keeps saying when they say modern. I think they mean that everything looks like they've processed it through 5 different apps before uploading it to Instagram. Facetune and Lightroom, really upping the saturation and contrast, and the VFX, it all adds to the vaguely fantasy-esque aesthetic of the series. The author of these novels says she sees her work as romantic fantasy rather than historical fiction, and I think to give them credit, they really have managed to capture that in the aesthetic. Honestly, most of the problems I have with this series could have been avoided if they just leaned into that and called it romantic fantasy. This modern Jane Austen vibe, it is actually something that we've seen before. My big comparison for this is the 2020 adaptation of Emma, directed by Autumn de Wilde. I'm not saying in any way that the production team saw Emma and thought, hey, let's do that, because obviously it came out when filming had finished on Bridgerton, but it had been in production for years beforehand. Bridgerton is not the first, and it won't be the last. The big difference is while Bridgerton is floating above the ground like a balloon, tethered ever so lightly to the earth, Emma is grounded both in its modern sensibilities and authentic period styling. Emma is vibrant and bright and funny, managing to translate Austen's humour to the present. It is incredibly stylish and visually bold, making use of its own intertextual touchstones, including The Handmaid's Tale, but all of Emma's references, all of Emma's boldness, it never stands out and it never takes over the plot and the writing. The writing stands on its own and the adaptation stands on its own. In Bridgerton, they use all of this slang and vocabulary which is meant to tether you to the Regency period, but it makes it feel incredibly unnatural and jarring. So the show comes across as confused about what exactly it wants to be. Emma, on the other hand, uses music to give us a sense of time and place, race. English folk music is used on multiple occasions, and the score is beautiful. It perfectly complements the visuals, but also had me going to Spotify straight after to listen to it on its own. I would like to say I'm a sucker for Wagnerian themes being used in film scores, and I will talk about this later in the music section when I talk about Game of Thrones. And Emma did that very well. I would rather watch a Jane Austen adaptation personally. Okay, I'm going to start this casting section with saying I have zero issue with non-white casting in Bridgerton. I did have an issue with the way they presented it though. Hey, the king fell in love and fixed racism, and now we have dukes who are not just white. Instead of either saying, we're doing colourblind casting so just deal with it, or coming back to the romantic fantasy angle, this is romantic fantasy so we can do whatever we want, they decided to try and justify the presence of their non-white actors by perpetuating the theory that basically every scholar has denounced, that Charlotte could have been mixed race based on reports that she had this one ancestor who lived 400 years before she was born, and who incidentally is also an ancestor of her white husband. Make it make sense. It's a trend that I keep seeing happening, people assuming the word Moor or Moorish is medieval code for black, but it's not. It was used to describe Muslim inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. Non-European DNA most likely would have been North African from countries like Morocco, Tunisia, rather than sub-Saharan, but also other parts of the Arabic world. Whether they migrated or converted, it's a cultural and religious grouping, whose individuals were persecuted for their religious beliefs, not for the colour of their skin. As someone who has 2 degrees in archaeology, that distinction is important. Not all non-white people are the same. I'm going to talk about David Copperfield. I love that film. Dev Patel was amazing, as he always is. The whole cast was amazing. It is the best example of truly colourblind casting, because they never mention it in the script. They were just like, hey, we're casting the best people for these roles because this is our adaptation and this is the way we want to do it. Now sit back and enjoy the story. And enjoy it I did. I didn't think about the ethnicities of any of these characters. The actors embodied them so well, and it never felt like they had to explain or justify their presence. Everyone should be able to see themselves in these characters. The third part of the styling of the show that I want to talk about is the music. That aha moment that I was talking about with the appearance of Legolas and the Hobbit. That is what happens every time we hear an orchestral version of Bad Guy or Wildest Dreams or any modern song in Bridgerton. It's meant to produce that emotional response that we have to that music. I love music, all kinds of music, but it has to be used in the right way. I have a specific example in mind to compare it to. In the opening of Game of Thrones Season 8, D&D admitted they wanted people to be reminded of the pilot, and so they used that same music. But if they knew anything about their own bloody show or spoke to the composer, who I love, by the way, he's literally my 3rd most listened to artist of all time on Spotify, they would know that that musical theme is literally the theme for House Baratheon, so it makes zero sense for them to use it in this context to show Dany and Jon parading into Winterfell. Sure, Gendry was there, but you see one shot of him in that whole sequence. And Ramin Djawadi knows how to use music to tell stories. When Kat comes to Ned with a raven from King's Landing telling them of the death of Jon Arryn in the pilot episode, we hear this theme, which we keep hearing at moments throughout seasons 1 and 2, when Joffrey makes a decision to kill a bunch of people, etc, etc. It's only in the liner notes for the season 3 soundtrack that we find out it is Littlefinger's theme. So for people who pay close attention to the music, the reveal that he was behind all of these things has such great payoff, because after you work it out, it was like we were in on a secret the whole time. It's such genius musical storytelling, and I could talk about him and what an amazing musical storyteller he is all day. They didn't announce it to be his theme and then use it when things were happening like a big sign saying, I want you to know it was Littlefinger, notice me. Anyway, my point is that the music playing in Bridgerton is not subtle and almost takes over the scenes where it's playing. It distracts you from the dialogue. So to sum up, Bridgerton tries to be modern historical fiction, but ends up becoming romantic fantasy, which isn't a bad thing, but don't call yourself historical fiction and don't set yourself up as better. And I think that's why so many people are drawn to it. It's not really challenging for the viewer. It's making you think of all the things you've loved before. And the show's modern meets Regency, sex scenes, the fact that it's Shonda Rhimes makes you forget that very problematic things happened in the plot which are not resolved satisfactorily and are unlikely to be resolved ever, given the handsome Duke is not going to be appearing in the later seasons. The intertextual references in the plot and in the styling are designed to cover up for the fact that none of the characters are really that well written or have very satisfying satisfying story arcs. For me personally, the number one thing that's important when I watch something is that the writing has to be good. Anyway, my rant is now over. Thank you for watching. Do let me know if you caught my intertextual references and Easter eggs. It was fun putting them in. I make videos about all sorts of cultural things, books, TV, music, history, personality, so do check them out if you want, and do like and subscribe if that's something that you want to do. Happy reading!